Well, welcome to the Coaches Lounge, and we are currently getting to talk with Frana and Caitlin about grief and all the psychosomatic or experiences of how that affects, our personal space. So I kind of wanted, to just help us like think about the times when we've experienced a loss or that kind of thing, how that affected us. Because I know for me, some of those moments were very physically intense. I remember this one time when I broke up with someone and it felt like the back of my heart chakra was just shredded. I actually had to get one of my Reiki students to send me energy to make it feel not raw. And even though I was feeling things emotionally, it was also there was like a physical sensation to it that I think isn't talked about a whole lot. Just in the world in general about how physical, loss can be, either from like, somebody leaving the planet and like or somebody leaving our lives as like a relational thing, or maybe we have to leave a situation on purpose ourselves. So um, I think that's something that perhaps a lot of people can relate to is that there's more to it than just mental processing, which I think a lot of people think grief is a mental thing of expectation that people are still there, if they haven't been through it. But no, grief is a lot more than just the mind or just the emotions or just like a physical loss. So do you feel like those are maybe moments that some of you can also relate to as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking I haven't tested it out for myself recently, but I know I've heard because it's the same responses in your brain as physical pain. Like you could take an ibuprofen for heartbreak, kind of thing, where your body processes it the same as if it was a physical experience. And I know for me, I also feel it in my heart chakra
Mhm.
that there's usually a lot of like extra weight and feeling and sadness that, like in my chest when I'm experiencing any level of grief.
Yeah, and sometimes that kind of like it kind of percolates out to the lungs as well. So like the energy, the chi of the body, definitely it can be like a heart related thing where people actually feel tense in their chest, or like they can't breathe deeply, or they just I don't know if you've ever like felt sad in your lungs. I don't know if that's like a sensory experience that maybe some of our listeners have had, but there's just like this, it's like a heavy feeling, but also the lungs just feel like it's not congested, but it's like more dense. And that's actually a lot of the cells are kind of like exhaling a lot of toxins and things that it's letting go of, because there is like an emotional oxytocin, all these like, feel good hormones that get released in the body when we're near those people or places or things. um, some of that, there's like a letting go process that's very physical. I don't know that I think sometimes I can get mistaken for like serious health conditions too, which can happen. Like loss can sometimes end up being like a physical breaking of the heart. That's like a clinically proven thing now, where different muscles in the heart really don't go back together the same way. And so the whole ibuprofen thing, where it's like take down the inflammation a bit and see if that helps. Because yeah, it's not it's not just an emotion thing that's like somewhere else. It's also very physical to the body. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That
it
It
does.
does. It makes a lot of sense. And the thing with grief, like some people find that they don't want to use the word grief, they just want to
Mhm.
use sadness because it feels less heavy. Grief feels it feels heavy in the body when you're going through it. I think there's
Mhm.
some denial of like how strongly upset someone
Yeah.
is because that's grief just feels different as and when you say it as well. If you say, I'm in grief, it's like,
Mhm.
wow, like you must be going through quite a lot. And it's like that acute pain almost. And it
Mhm.
affects the body in so many different ways. Like I remember a time when my grandma died and I felt such acute grief, which was like not just the physical crying, but it's the heaviness around the chest as well, like you were saying, around the heart. But also it's like maybe people feel that they can't eat as much as they used to as well. So it really affects the stomach and the gut. There seems to be a big connection there as well with grief. But I completely agree that grief is not isolated to just death and loss of a loved one. Like there's even, I find people who are going through the healing process as adults, there's a grief of like a childhood that could have been, like the grief of like, of, yeah, not experiencing childhood as they want to have, and only healing that at a later stage. So there is grief in different ways, or even of a job, if you've lost a job. And if people think, well, you can't grieve these things. But if it feels important to you and it's part of your being, then losing these things can be huge. And I think it's important to find the right words to describe our kind of our emotions, but also the physical effects they're having. Because sadness would feel different. You'd be like, yeah, it's sad. And it's, yeah, it feels less heavy. But it's important to get the right words as well sometimes, so that you know what you're dealing with as well.
Yeah, I feel like there can be a lot of emotional repression that goes on with, with the whole letting go process, or loss, process. I feel like, it can be loss of different things, like even moving can be a loss, or what have you. Any kind of like life change can be a loss. And I think people need to be very honest about what they're experiencing instead of repressing it. Because I've seen that happen where, a client, loses a loved one and then goes, yeah, I feel fine for like a year. And I'm like, no, you're not. Did you take some time off work? Did you did you take a moment to feel that experience? And they're like, no. And they're like, yeah, I don't know why I can't concentrate on my work. Well, how's that working out for you? Typical psychologist response, like, how's that going? And I feel like that's something that it can be eventually like very dangerous. People aren't being truly honest with themselves, because that grief, that loss gets stored in the body somewhere. It's not like it stopped happening. It doesn't stop experiencing. The body is probably experiencing it to some extent, but it might be storing it as like muscle tension, or like in the fatty tissues, it might store it there, or maybe storing it in the organs, which is really not great. So it's something that people do need to address. They need to like give themselves time and space to feel and mentally process, because it's not something that can be ignored ultimately. It's not good for the health. We'll put it that way. It's very stressful. It's stressful experiencing it, but it might be even more stressful not experiencing it.
It's like people want to avoid the suffering, but in trying to avoid it, they create more suffering. It's one of those things that you can't get away with it on this particular one. If there's a deep pain or something, instead of more short-term grief, you end up entering long-term grief. And then without help and support, like you were doing with your client, it can just affect all aspects of your life in different ways, like not concentrating on your work and finding that you just don't want to do anything anymore. So it kind of almost goes into a depression. And I think a lot of people want to feel like they're strong and trying to get closure as quickly as possible.
Or
they're like, yeah, I cried at the funeral, or I'm fine.
I had a few beers.
And it's just that repression, and then maybe numbing themselves instead of actually feeling and going through the processes. And there is a famous thing that we have, the 5 stages of grief as well, which not everyone goes through. There's no guide on grief. Like, it's so unique and individual for everyone. Although many people do go through the 5 stages, which are denial, then there's the anger stage, bargaining, and then the depression, and finally that acceptance, where you're like, okay, it's happened and I'm finally at the other end of it. But there's no set way to do things. Some people might want to just be alone. Some people might want to be around lots of people. You might want to cry lots. You might not want to cry at all. It's really is unique to you. I think this is where the somatic experience comes in. which Jess, I know you work with a lot, which is feeling into your body and feeling
Mhm.
where it feels maybe painful or heavy, and letting it process rather than saying, hey, I'm fine. Because sometimes it's subtle as well, because you can tell yourself you're fine, and your brain will kind of, your conscious mind will override and get you through the day in some way or other. And you think, I'm going to rely on this because I got through the day and I didn't have to deal with it. How
Yeah.
great is that? And it becomes that crutch of, I just don't want to look at it because it's going to hurt.
Mhm.
And that's, I think, the process that we have to guide our clients through and coach our clients through as well. And perhaps the therapy is also a good option, if especially when it's long-term grief and you've really not dealt with it. That may be a very, very good idea as well.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely times when people are wanting a formula. That same client was asking me if there was like a 12-step program or like something that I had for grief. And I'm like, everyone's different. Some people skip actually directly to acceptance, like this is what has happened. And they actually skip all the other previous steps. So they're in grief immediately because they're feeling it as they go like lost throughout their day, whatever it is. Or maybe they really are feeling it in their body. And so just like there's no formula for these things. Like we can try to say this could be what's typical of a lot of people, but it's certainly not everyone. They don't even
Yeah.
it's not even typical then, each relationship to each circumstance, person or place is so different. So, what it looks like on the outside could be different. Some people might actually just be sad. They might not be deeply somatically feeling it quite in that same way. And they still might want the support. They still might want a life coach because to them it's very extreme in some way, to the point where they have a lot of thoughts that come up. I feel like people confuse grief with thinking, or they confuse it with just being so super emotional. But it can be like the full spectrum. Like I don't feel like it's just one thing. So processing it can get confusing, but it can also be an opportunity for letting go of a lot of things, transforming ourselves. I feel like sometimes we have to become different people in order to feel all of that. And that's what they're trying to avoid. They're one trying to avoid feeling uncomfortable, which is very typical in a lot of Western societies. And then B,
Yeah.
they're also trying to not become someone different on the other side of that experience.
Oh, but that's just growth. You can't avoid being someone different.
Oh, they're not here for that.
Uh,
People are so good at avoiding growth. They're experts, and total masters at it.
and I think that's where your body will really like come back around and get you, because our bodies are also masters at like forcing you to deal with it. So it's like if you don't want to deal with the emotion or sit in it and have whatever experience processing is going to be for you as the individual, your body will take the energy where you've shoved it down and harnessed it away and create something else with it. And it's like you can sit on that for as long as you want, but at some point, like your body's gonna force you to deal with it in one
Mhm.
way or another.
It's like always, like pumping water into like a vessel or something, right? The water has to go somewhere eventually, otherwise it's going to be like a hydraulic press and it's just going to press until like, explode somewhere. Like it has to go somewhere. Like water always has to be flowing, and the body always has to be flowing because it's always changing out new cells. And so if you're telling it to like hold on to a looping program of emotion or thought, that's where it's like, I don't get this. What is this program that's still running here? We're always cleaning things. So why are we still putting it back in? Why are we putting these hormones back into this one spot? And so that's when the genetics can get a little confused and start trying to compensate basically for that hormonal influx. So yeah, I feel like, it's not something that there's like not a pacing for it, for grief. Like you don't have to deal with it immediately, but gonna have to get around to it sometime.
And I also feel like the energy of avoidance is very different to once you've kind of gone through the grief and accepted it. And once you're in avoidance, you're going to start avoiding other things in life as well. And the universe will give you more pain almost as a way for you to have to deal with it. And like you were saying, you start to, with our thoughts, we create our hormones as well. So if we're feeling sad, we're going to create more of the corresponding hormones. Whereas if we're very happy, we're going to create more dopamine. And if we're feeling really like tense and negative, there's going to be more changes in our body because it affects everything. And that's why you tend to feel more sick and have a headache and, you know, kind of have all these somatic experiences. And I think back to the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza. I remember reading his book, You Are the Placebo, which is such an interesting concept. And the concept being that when they develop drugs, they give them to a bunch of people. But they have to have a control group who are just given effectively sugar pills, which are placebos. And what they find from kind of countless studies for many decades is that people who take the real drug get better, not 100%, you know, there's a percentage, but a really good percentage of the placebo group get better. So what this book was really looking at was how on earth does that work? What made them better? Because we think medicine will make us better or something outside of us needs to happen to cure this, some 12-step program or, you know, some special pill. Just give me the pill and I'll be fine. But something was happening with the placebo group. And literally this keeps happening in every drug trial ever. There's never nobody that gets better from the placebo, which is what should be happening. So clearly we generate healing from our mind and our thoughts. And what they found was actually the people who thought they were taking the drug. So suppose there was one for, I think there was a specific one for asthma, actually. People who were like, oh, I have severe asthma. I have to take this inhaler to get better. And some were given actual just water vapor pumps. And they were like, oh yeah, my asthma is so much better. It's fine. I can breathe easier because this new drug has been given to me. And the thing is, it wasn't just in their mind. So when they started to think they were getting the new drug, their body started to create the right enzymes and hormones and electrolytes to actually heal the actual asthma. So which is easy to me. So there's such a huge link that people aren't aware of. Like we're so reliant, especially on the West, of doctors. I need a doctor to fix this and that's it, I'm done. But if you don't heal the emotional pain and your thought processes, you're not going to actually, it's always going to come back effectively.
And it's really funny that you chose that example because asthma is actually related to grief.
Wow, exactly.
in the Taoist tradition, they talk about asthma, like the lungs not being able to breathe deeply is not taking in the present moment, because there's something in the past that they're holding on to. And so asthma, to some degree, maybe not all of it all the time, but sometimes it can be related to loss and not processing, or maybe there's like continual loss going on. Maybe like there's like somebody's in a position of authority taking away some of our freedom or something that we have not a whole lot of control over, and we're still in that situation. That's what's causing the asthma. So some of the grief could be ongoing. It's like, you know, sometimes we have to get out of the situation that's causing us grief, causing us to not fully breathe and like want to be there. So I feel like that could be a huge, you know, step one would be acknowledge where we're at, you know, what is the root cause here. It might not always be obvious, but it is important to be honest with what we're feeling. I'd say that step one is recognizing what those physical symptoms feel like, which can be like tension, usually tension in the chest or lungs, maybe asthma, maybe, you know, feeling like there's tension between the shoulder blades and the back, often like basically the whole upper chest. That can be like a huge sign of grief that might not be acknowledged. There's some tension there.
Definitely. I think there's so many places in the body that we we often again attribute to just medicine and science, where the root cause of it was it an emotional pain. So it may not be grief, but something else altogether. So it can even be knee pain, and that's kind of manifested. And I like to listen to things where it's like what in the body is related to what kind of emotion. And I find that really, really interesting. Just like you were saying, lungs and grief are hugely connected. And so many other parts of the body are connected to other specific emotions. And I find it so, so interesting how like knee pain might not just be knee pain. It could be that you're not feeling stable or safe in some way. And there's other things
Not
that
wanting to
are
move
related.
forward. Yeah.
Yes, one that's the one. Yes. So I know Carla, who's our other coach who usually joins us, has a thick book like this thick, all about the body and what it's connected to emotionally. But she's not here today. But yeah, there are entire volumes written on the subject. And it's always worth exploring. Like if you've tried everything else and you're still feeling pain in certain areas, it might be worth thinking, hey, let me try Eastern medicine or that emotional healing that perhaps will cause change. And it's the thing, like most people aren't so aware of their own emotions. And I listened to another podcast called The Healing Point, where there's a woman who specifically works on the body and where pain started and when it started. And people are like, if there's nothing going on, nothing at all. And they're like, she'll literally ask the question, so when did this exact problem start? And they're like, yeah, I was 6 or 7. And she goes, okay, cool. So did anything happen when you were 6 or 7? And they're like, my father left unexpectedly. And it's like, yeah, that might have something to do with it. But that person had never made the connection, because we're like, well, father left, and okay, fine. But there's more to it. It depends. Everyone holds.
What does that have to do with my liver? It's like, well, yeah, I knew someone who, I think they were like 1 or maybe 2 relationships down the road from not having grieved from that first one. And they're like, yeah, I don't know why these other relationships didn't work out. I'm like, so what? You didn't grieve about the first, like losing the first, like it wasn't a good relationship. They hadn't grieved about it. And it's like, well, okay. Let's start with slowing down, because I feel like that's the first part is people don't slow down enough to feel what they need to feel. And that takes like zoning out, which is like unfocusing your eyes or maybe listening to some music or just turning everything off and just gazing out into space for like being a cat, basically, just gaze out into space for no reason. At that point, that's kind of usually when those emotions or thoughts will start coming up, and not everyone gives themselves enough space anymore.
I definitely feel like that's an issue for a lot of people. It's like, well, I don't have the time to grieve now, so I'll just do it never. Instead of being like, let me look at my calendar. You know what? If I fall apart Wednesday evening, that works. I can fit that into my schedule. Like, I don't have other plans, so maybe I'll just take the time to see what comes up. But I don't think enough people do that. It's like, well, not in this moment, so probably never. And that's when the pushing things aside starts to happen.
Or maybe that's they're intentionally doing it where they're overscheduling themselves. They have something for every second of the day, so they don't have to feel whatever it is. And so it can either be they're keeping themselves busy and they don't know it, which can be some of the more dangerous things, or maybe they're self-medicating in some other way. They're using some other kind of, either alcohol or, plants of various kinds. I've seen people use what is supposed to be ceremonial plant medicine to not feel things, which is definitely not the way to use that. That's not how that works. So I feel like being willing to set aside or constructing our lives in such a way that we have a lot of downtime in the week, and constructing our lives around, I need to leave myself space to feel. That would be optimal, but not everyone either can or prioritizes that. or is willing to just sit for a while and not do anything. But that is really what needs to happen. You're right, Caitlin. Is they need to be able to look at their calendar and be like, I'm not doing anything this evening intentionally. Like my plans are to not have plans.
Yeah, even if it was just like 15 minutes to cry yourself to sleep some night before bed, it's like that emotional release is going to have so much power in it if you've been holding things back to just give yourself 10, 15 minutes to.
And the thing is, people feel so much better after they cry. It's like it's very cathartic, and there's a lot of like hormones that get released whenever the body lets go of those things. It's like taking an internal shower.
Yeah. And I think the amount of time it will take to do some of these things is also kind of that misconception. You're like, oh, well, I don't have 3 hours. But it's like if you just gave yourself 10 minutes, like you'd probably process more than you realize in just those 10 minutes. And yeah, maybe your lunch break is not a good time at all to only have some time and then come back to it. But if you gave yourself 10 or 15 minutes at night, like you'd probably process a lot pretty quickly.
That's really how it works, right? Because when something happens with small children, like they fall down or they get hurt or something, like they're intensely upset about it for like 5 minutes. And then they're over it. They're feeling things so intensely that once they're done with it and they're on to the next thing. But I think as adults, we have so many inhibitions to feeling or to being with ourselves and not wanting to feel pain supposedly, that we're repressing. And that repression is actually what takes grief, it takes a long time to process, is because we're stopping the process. If we were really there for the process, it would probably be done a lot faster than anyone thinks.
Yeah.
I think that child
grief also has
Go ahead.
Grief also has those waves that come over people, like they kind of process it, and then there's just waves of it if there's anything that reminds them of the other person or situation. So it's sometimes riding the wave when it happens, because there's no other way to really do it. And instead of, again, repressing each time, because some people are like, well, I did it once, I cried that one time, and it's, again, I don't want any more. And so, but that's the thing, like we were saying before, it's so unique to each person, and it depends how emotionally connected you were to the thing or person that you lost, of how much is going to affect your day-to-day life. But it's being aware that it's not going to be, I'm done, I could shut the door and be done. It's going to be, there may be some waves of it, little echoes of the pain here and there, depending on what you're doing and what you're being reminded of and what you're being triggered of. And just being aware that that's really normal. And it's okay. It's okay that you're going to feel that pain sometimes, perhaps even in unrelated times. You're like, well, where is this wave of grief coming from? It's just, it was a very strong emotion. It's not always just one hit, one curing and done.
Yeah, I feel like the waves are kind of really important to process. But if they give themselves the space, because I've seen people stop themselves from feeling that, and it's definitely not something that it's better to like let go of that shame and guilt of, this is not society appropriate, to just experiencing it anyway. And when it comes to grief that's been there for like a really long time, I think sometimes we might need people to hold space for us, because we don't know how to get down to those emotions anymore. Like it's not there at the surface where those waves are available. And so sometimes when being witnessed or like telling our story or whatever, that's when those waves come up. And that way they can be processed a little bit easier, because we're actually being supported in that moment. Like sometimes that's what people need, is just to like hold their hand and say it's okay, or just be there, because if that grief has been there for a really long time, there's a reason for that. There's a reason that they didn't go there when it was really available. And there's probably some sort of fear or shame or, anger or something else that they didn't want to feel. And so sometimes having that support can be really helpful in, letting it go. And also like maybe finding better coping mechanisms, because obviously whatever it was we were doing wasn't really working to begin with. Like that's why it got stuck for so long.
Yeah, that's a very good point. The idea that if you try to deal with it yourself and you're not making that space and time for yourself, finding a coach or a therapist who will, because then you've got an appointment, right? And then in that appointment, that 1 hour that you have, that's almost like automatic space created, because that's what we all do as coaches or therapists, which is create space for the person's emotions to come up and leave just that little bit of like a gap. We're not going to be talking endlessly or trying to fill every space. We're going to be like, hey, like there's something coming up here. Let's give it that time. And that could be, well, I've noticed that some clients do that, where they actually don't process during the week and they wait for the sessions to actually process everything that's going on, because there's, like we said, there's no time. So sometimes just scheduling it with another person and then feeling that support that a coach or therapist gives you and that guidance of how to process through it is exactly what someone needs. And it just is, instead of doing it all alone, where it can feel almost like there's some shame to it, just
Mhm.
doing it in front of someone or with someone, even if that's a loved one, it's there's healing in groups, that's like part of being human. We heal together more easily when we feel shared experiences as well. So there might be like a group you can join if you're feeling so much grief that's local to your area or online, where you find that there's other people in similar situations to yourself, and it just, you don't feel as alone and you don't feel silly about everything that's been coming up for you, because you might feel like, oh my gosh, am I doing it wrong? Am I doing grief wrong? And it's just like, okay, well, here's the plethora of people who are doing it in their own ways, and you get to just witness that and be part of that and be on the other side, where it's not always being that person that people look at with pity, like, oh, she's been through so much, or he's been through so much. It's also, you get to be that person who's there for others as well. So there's just group healing is an amazing thing, as well as if you just have that one-to-one interaction rather than just always on your own.
Yeah, I would also say that when people are letting go of big emotions like that, I feel like it's also really important to put positive emotions back in. So, like, be in positive spaces or go to that party after a good cry. Because even though we might not be the happiest person there, we actually, the person that's experiencing grief is the person that needs to put in good, it's actually good energy back into the body. Like it needs to fill that space. So either like doing art or dancing or, going out, something that in nature or, going to a concert or something like that. That's really important to be around positive people, places, and things. Because sometimes I think, people going through grief, they kind of just get shoved, like, oh, we won't invite them because they're sad. Like we won't bother them kind of thing. And it's like that's not what they need. They might not need a person to like pretend everything's fine. But
Yeah.
they also still need to go to like places that are positive so that they can sort of like, help to recharge themselves if they don't know their own personal recharging mechanisms, because it's helpful to know like, oh, what I personally need is I need to go swimming, or I need to go do some painting, or I need to go, do some music or something. Know what kind of like recharging like helps them feel full again. Whatever that is, they really need to surround themselves with definitely group emotional support of some kind, but then also positive experiences, because the body needs to be able to recharge, like let go of things, but it needs to be able to recharge and take in good things as well. Like it's like a whole holistic thing. It's not just like one
Mm-hmm.
aspect. I feel like that people forget that part a lot. It's like when you're letting go, you always have to put in good memories or experiences back in.
Yes.
Yeah, oh yeah. If you
That's
leave that
a good
hole,
point.
it'll get filled with something. So you want to have
Something.
control over making sure it's positive emotions this time if you just released a bunch of
Mhm.
sadness and heaviness.
Yeah, because I feel like people can get stuck in that spiral that isn't um, you know, native to that the actual original grief. It's actually stemming from the fact that maybe they were just in sort of like a negative physical space. The actual room that they're in wasn't conducive to giving them energy back. And so they can just kind of spiral because there's no movement. It's stagnant in their lives. And so there needs to be that flow of positive either thought or watching positive shows or something that's warm and heartfelt that needs to happen too, because it can't be getting stuck in that loop of time. Like, yes, feel it, but get stuck there.
Yeah. Oh, I
Yeah,
feel
I
like
love.
cleaning out a room, like opening a window, turning on a
Mhm,
fan, saging a place, like if you process enough in one physical
mhm,
space, you have to clean out the physical room then too.
mhm, mhm. Play some loud, very good music. Do something.
Yeah.
Moving, right? Because emotion is energy in motion. And with grief, it's just stuck. And that's why I love that you said just like dancing is such a great way of releasing, moving in some way. I know some people do something called shaking, where they actually just physically shake on purpose and kind of just moving different parts of their body. And it just helps to get that movement of the actual energy within your body. So
Mhm,
whatever gets you to move. And if you're not a great dancer and you don't go out on the dance floor, do it at home, just
mhm,
like put some music on in your room and just get moving in some way. And it didn't have to be
mhm.
dance.
It could be
Like some
football.
people
That's
like
fine too. It's
sports.
all basketball. That's great.
Yeah. Sports are just running, anything that just gets you moving in some way and gets the energy moving. I love
Mhm,
that you said go to some positive places too, because it's just because you're sad doesn't mean you only have to be sad. We still get to feel the range of emotions, and
mhm,
you don't have to feel guilty that you maybe
mhm,
lost something and you're moving on, because life does continue despite
mhm,
everything. And it's
mhm,
kind of that's where the acceptance comes from, like they're gone or that thing's gone, but I'm still here and I'm still going to move forward and
mhm.
do the best I can with this life I've been given.
I
Hmm.
think one last thing I would want to say about grief is that also don't trivialize grief. Like, just because that thing might not be hugely significant, it's still important to recognize the feeling. Like, that was still a favorite car. Still sad about it. It's fine. Like, don't trivialize whatever the experience is. Like, just because it mentally doesn't make sense doesn't mean that it's not a loss on some level. And to acknowledge that. Like, don't blow it out of proportion either, but also like let it be what it is.
Yeah, that's a great final point. I don't know if anyone else had anything else to add, but I think we've covered most things to kind of go through and think about when you are
Mhm.
experiencing grief. So, yeah.
Yeah, are there any like final tips that you would give to someone if they were maybe about to or they are? I would say that if I was gonna, if someone has a tendency to be very like mind oriented, I think doing some journaling or even writing a letter to that situation or person could be really helpful. Because sometimes people need to get it out on paper or
Mhm.
they need to retreat or need to do some art of some kind in order to get it out there. But I think sometimes journaling can be really define, puts to words, uses the right words to the experience so people can start feeling deeply in their emotions and their. So what would you
I
say
think,
would be a tip for.
I would say don't grieve alone, even though like alone may be your process, but as long as you're like telling a friend or family, loved one, trusted one, like I've got some stuff that I'm working through. And sometimes that's a simple ask of like, can we make plans for Friday night, or can I call you to help process this or something, so that someone in your life knows what's going on. I think that's important, even if you are someone who wants to do most of the actual processing alone. The whole
Mhm.
experience doesn't have to be alone.
I think we're having some technical issues. I think Jess is, oh, she's trying to join us again. But sorry about the audio going a little bit muffled when Jess was speaking. But yes, I would agree with Jess as well with that emotional release writing is great. That's where you just write out, like almost scroll your feelings. And then you can rip that piece of paper up, like no one has to read it. No one has to be aware that it exists, and you can even burn it if you want to. But I also loved your earlier tips, Jess, which was like acknowledge where you're at. Because sometimes it's like actually maybe I've been avoiding, and it's just saying, okay, let's see where I'm at. But I would say the biggest thing I would say is get some support as well. Like you don't have to do it alone. It's so much easier when someone's there to be with you and support you, and who's kind of been trained to deal with these kind of things and human emotion without adding all the judgment and the, hey, just get over it now, that just holding that space for you. That's not your friend and you're feeling like you're like burdening them now. Just getting that professional help is just huge, more than you will ever know. So yeah, and it doesn't even have to be for so long. Even a few sessions can really help clear out that locked energy, and also just get some movement going as well. I love that one because that one's fun. Just go have some fun sometimes, get that energy moving, but don't ignore, like enjoy the full aspect of being human. Like that is what we're on earth for. You get to experience all the emotions at some stage or other.
Like that, because sometimes the friends that are around us are not ready to deal with our emotions.
Yeah, so true.
Good point.
So true. With that being said, we'll finish off today's episode. I hope you all enjoyed our thrilling talk about grief. And if you are experiencing any problems or like are experiencing grief and need support, like this within the show notes are our contact details to actually get in touch should you want to do that. And we'll see you all next week for our next show. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.